recording. Okay, let's do this. So, ladies and gentlemen, the first thing we need to answer is our definition of invasive species. So, key thing to remember with invasive species that makes them harmful is that they are a non-native species whose intro causes harm to the native environment. So, non-native species whose introduction So it's a non-native species whose introduction causes harm to the native environment. I know that this exact question shows up on your test, so you do need to know this definition. Right. Next part is you need to be able to answer the questions below using the food web provided. So this food web right here on your test is going to be a slightly different food web, but it's very similar. The first question is you need to be able to name all the examples of producers. So the producers are always going to be at the bottom or at the start of your food web. Now I'm going to use my little drawing tool here. So looking down here, at the beginning of my food chain, there are 4 different organisms that are present. We have corn, flowering plants, lavenders, and mangoes. Right, and I'll scroll up a little bit for those of you that are finishing up this definition. All right. It says name all examples of producers. As we saw, it's corn, flowering plants, lavenders, and mangoes. All right, so I can put this down as my answers. Okay. Other thing to remember is that all producers for you are almost always going to be plants. So if you see a plant on a food chain, that's where your producers are, and that's where the start of your food web is. All right, next one. So name all the examples of primary consumers. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, if we remember, primary consumers are the organisms that eat plants, right, are otherwise known as herbivores. So looking at our chart here, we only have 3 examples of herbivores. We have grasshoppers that eat corn. We have butterflies that eat flowering plants and lavenders. And we have fruit flies that eat mangoes. So our answers would be grasshoppers, let's see, butterflies, and fruit flies. Sorry, fruit fly. Those are all examples of primary consumers. Right. Next question is asking us, well, let me change up my OBS. There we go. Alright, so name all the examples of apex predators. So apex predators are the top of the food chain. Apex means top. Well, if you look up here, the top of our food chain, if we follow these arrows, we have pythons and we have eagles. So pythons is one, eagles is another, and I would even accept if you also put down wolves. They're very high up the food chain. Right? Any questions, comments, concerns on how to read a food web? Remember, you will need to be able to do this on your test. All right, let's go to the next question. So, the next question we're going to be focused on is which two statements are supported by the food web above? So up above at our food web. Now, because it's a multiple choice question, we're going to go through each question or each choice and figure out if it's right or wrong. So A says eagles eat only animals, so they don't rely on plants. So thing to remember, that eagles, they're up here, it is true that they do not eat plants. They only eat other animals. But their prey, or the animals they eat, rely on other animals that eat plants. Okay? Key thing to remember here is that if we took out all the plants on this food web, then all the animals would have nothing to eat and they would gradually starve to death. So we know that A is wrong. Now B says because eagles eat wolves, eagles act as a limiting factor on the wolf population. So looking up here, we see an arrow that goes from wolves to eagles. So we know that wolves are exerting the limiting factor predation on, eagles are preying on wolves, reducing their population. We do know that B is correct. And I'm going to use a highlighter, or the highlighter tool for this. All right. So C says, because grasshoppers eat corn, they act as a limiting factor on corn. So we're going to go up to our food web, look at our grasshopper, see that there's an arrow that points from corn to grasshoppers, showing that energy is transferring from the corn to the grasshopper. So in this case, grasshoppers would be exerting a limiting factor on the corn by eating it and reducing its population. Ooh, that's an ugly color. Let's try this one instead. All right. So, good test taking strategy here. It only asked for two statements. We determined which two were correct, so we don't even need to read B. Alright, so next question. Decomposers are not shown in this food web. What would happen to the ecosystem if there were not any decomposers? Now, decomposers are typically I would call them the cleanup crew of ecosystems. So they break down all the dead bodies, or they break down wood. If you've ever seen a rotting log, that's actually fungus or decomposers that are breaking down that rotting log. So if there were no decomposers, what would happen is that dead matter, and matter is just what we're made out of, or what living things are made out of. So dead matter would pile up, and all populations would decrease. Right? Give you all some time if you're writing this down. But what would happen to the ecosystem if there were not any decomposers is that dead matter would pile up, because nothing would be cleaning it up, and all populations would decrease. So that means plants and animal populations would decrease. All right. Next question. It says true or false. Energy only moves up the trophic chain. All right. So remember, the reason we draw these arrows on this food web is to show which direction energy is flowing to. So if I started with corn, I follow where my arrow is pointing. It's pointing to grasshoppers. I know that as the grasshopper eats the corn, energy is flowing from the corn to the grasshopper. When the rat eats the grasshopper, energy is flowing from the grasshopper to the rat. When the eagle eats the rat, I know that energy is flowing from the rat to the grasshopper because of the direction the arrow is pointing. Right? We don't see on this food web, we don't see any arrows going backwards. We don't see an arrow pointing from the eagle to the mangoes. That does not happen. So we know that this statement is true. That energy only moves up the trophic chain. All right. So which level of the trophic chain has the most biomass/energy? Remember, biomass is just what you're made of, or what living things are made out of. Right. In this case, towards the bottom of the food web, so corn, flowering plants, lavenders, and mangoes, this is where the most energy is available to them. So it would be producers. Right, if you want another physical example of this, you can look out your window. How many plants do you see every single day compared to humans? You'll see far more plants than humans. Right. So next part is which geometric model is just a fancy term for shape. So which geometric model is generally used to represent the trophic levels of an ecosystem? Right? So as you move further and further up the trophic chain, there is less and less energy available to you. So the model that is typically used for this is a pyramid or a triangle. And the reason for that is it shows how the amount of energy that's available is being reduced the higher you go up the trophic chain. All right. Do keep in mind, this is a question that definitely shows up on your test. All right. Next question. So deer eat grasses and other plants. Suppose that a population of deer in the meadow increases over a period of time. Of the following events, which is the most likely to be the cause of this increase? Now, don't freak out at how wordy this question is. All it is saying is which one of these answer choices would cause an increase in the deer population. So what would cause the deer population to increase over time? All right, let's go through each one. So A says a decrease in biomass of meadow grasses. Now we know that deer are herbivores. They eat grass. So if there was less grass available to them, the deer would starve, thereby decreasing their population. Right? Because we know that A is false. Now I'm going to highlight the ones in red that I'm crossing out. Right, so B says increased population of plant-eating insects. So we know that deer, again, they're herbivores. So if there's an increase in the population of plant-eating insects, that means they're going to have to compete with each other, thereby reducing the deer population. So we know that this one is wrong, or this one is false. We can cross it out. C says the emigration of deer predators from the meadow. Now think back. We did a case study about this with the wolves in Yosemite Park. When the wolf population was wiped out and wiped to extinction by humans, the deer population exploded. It increased a lot. So we know that C is correct because if you take away the deer's predators, the deer population will continue to grow. We know that C is the correct answer. All right. D says immigration of deer competitors from surrounding area. Immigration means that more competitors would live with the deer, thereby reducing their population. And then E says an equal decrease in both birth rate and death rate of the deer, or equal decrease. This would just result in a decrease in the deer population. We know E is a red herring. It's not true. It's trying to trick you. So the correct answer here is C. All right, let's continue. So a graph represents the growth, or the graph represents the growth of a population of dandelions over time. A question down here, you can see that. The population is most likely growing under which set of conditions? So, thing to remember is that this graph has a J curve to it. It's going to keep increasing, 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 increasing forever. There's no limit to it. All right? So that would be exponential growth. Right? Thinking back to our notes, and I'll show you guys this again. That exponential growth is always going to have this J curve to it that points straight up, while logistic growth, which has a carrying capacity, will have this S shape to it, where it flattens out. All right, so next question that I may have forgot to delete. Whoops. So does the graph above have a carrying capacity? We know that this graph has an S curve, or sorry, this graph has a J curve to it. So the population will continue to double forever and ever. So in this case, we know that this has no carrying capacity. Ooh. There we are. Alrighty then. Let's move on to number 12. So a bright full moon allows predators that use their eyes to hunt rabbits while they are sleeping. So reducing populations of rabbits. Identify the abiotic and biotic factors present. Now this question has a few parts to it. First thing, we have to remember what abiotic and biotic factors are. Right? So do keep in mind that abiotic factors are non-living factors in the environment. So this would be weather, sunlight, storms, rain. Anything that is not alive would be an abiotic factor. While biotic factors are living factors in the environment. So everything that a living thing can do. All right. So this is a multiple choice or question. We're going to go through each one, determine which ones are true and which ones are not. So A says the abiotic factor is the bright full moon. Now we know that a bright full moon is a non-living thing. The moon is not alive. So this first part is correct. Second part is while the biotic factor is the darkness of night. So, ladies and gentlemen, very quickly in the chat box, tell me this. Is darkness alive? Is darkness a living thing? Yeah, very good. So darkness is not something that is alive. So we know that A is not true, it's false. I'm going to highlight that in red to show that we're not picking it. Right, B says the biotic factor is the wolves hunting the deer. Or sorry, the abiotic factor, I corrected myself. The abiotic factor is the wolves hunting the deer. All right. So abiotic factors we know are non-living factors in the environment. Are wolves alive or are they not alive? Very good. So wolves are alive, meaning that this statement is false because wolves cannot be an abiotic factor. So we can cross that one out. Next one, C. The abiotic factor is the bright full moon. We know that part's correct. while the biotic factor is the wolves hunting the deer. So we know that biotic factors are living factors in the environment. Wolves hunting deer is an example of a living factor in the environment. C, every part of this is correct. So C would be our answer choice. All right, and then D says the abiotic factor is the deer sleeping at night, while the biotic factor is the wolves seeing during the day. D is not correct because it's saying an abiotic factor is the deer sleeping at night. Deer are alive, so it cannot be an abiotic factor. All right, let's continue. So next thing we're going to talk about are these population graphs. Now, some students struggled with these before, so we're going to take some time to talk about it. First thing, we have to determine which country is shrinking, growing, or staying stable. So country 1, we have a large amount, and let me get my drawing tool. We have a large amount of the population that is either young or in their early to late 20s, meaning that early to late 20s are having children. All right, so country 1, a lot of people are having children. That would mean that their population is growing. All right, country 2, let's get my full desktop here. Country 2 has what I call the smashed egg shape. So if you took an egg and you stood up straight and you smashed it on the table, the bottom would flatten out. So country 2 has that smashed egg shape, a nice even distribution of ages in the population, meaning that their population is stable. So it is neither growing or shrinking. Right. And then country 3. Now this one we're going to talk a little bit about. This is something that students struggle with. Make sure we're looking at this. Get rid of my drawings. So for country 3, up here towards the top, these bars are much larger than the rest of the graph, indicating that this population of people has a very high amount of older individuals, your grandmas, your grandpas, people that are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s. So those individuals are not having children. Right? While the bottom portion of the graph has a very small number of individuals that are in their late to early 20s or that are children. So because this population has a very small amount of individuals that are actually having children, that would mean that their population is shrinking. Right? If you're not having a large amount of children, you have more older individuals, your population will shrink over time. All right, let's continue. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is the difference between density independent factors and density dependent factors? Remember, both of these terms are vocabulary terms that you need to know for the test. They show up on it. Right, let me change this. So first one I'm going to start talking about is density independent. So density independent factors, if we mark correctly, density independent factors do not rely on population size. All right. So that means density independent factors, some examples of that can be weather. So rains, thunderstorms, stuff like that. Tornadoes are another one. Hurricanes is another. So stuff in the environment that's going to happen regardless of the population size. So next one would be density dependent. So density dependent factors do rely on population size. Right, so these are factors that are influenced by the size of the population. A really, really good example of this are diseases. So diseases are a really good example of this. Competition is another one. So there's only so much land or almost so much land or so much food that's available to organisms. Right. Good hint I'm going to give you all is that if you see a question that's on the test that's talking about diseases, you should immediately think that it's talking about a density dependent factor. All right, let's continue. So, ladies and gentlemen, what is definition of tolerance in biology? Tolerance is an organism's ability, so I'll type this out, an organism's ability to survive in an environment that is not its own. Or actually, let's do you one better. So, tolerance is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce under circumstances that differ from its optimal conditions. This is what I like to call how tough is that organism, or how good is that organism at surviving outside of its natural environment. All right. So tolerance is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce under circumstances that differ from its optimal conditions. Lichen are a really good example of this. If you guys remember what lichen are those green fuzzy organisms. They kind of look like moss that can grow on bare rock. All right. Let's continue.
Mr. Carver, can you go back up?
Why, yes, I can.
Okay, you can go back down there.
Very good. So we're almost done. And don't worry, I'll spend some time towards the end of the class going over more questions. So the scenario here is that the Ice Age ended about 10,000 years ago and the glaciers retreated, leaving behind bare, gravel, rocks, and sand. So huge chunks of ice were left, also left where the glaciers had been for many thousands of years. These chunks of ice melted, creating small lakes and ponds. So key thing for us to remember is that when the Ice Age ended, it left bare gravel and rocks. So there's no soil. All right, so which statement best describes one of the changes that an area experienced after the Ice Age ended in the scenario above? So in the scenario above, we are talking about an area that's starting with just bare rock. No soil, no pre-existing environment, it's just bare rock. All right. If we look back at our notes, the type of succession that takes place for this is primary succession. And remember that key species for primary succession that takes place is lichen. So lichen takes place because lichen can grow on bare rock. Answer to this one would be primary succession is taking place. The reason I know that is that we start with gravel, rocks, and sand. Okay, let's continue. So, ladies and gentlemen, last question. And this question like this does show up on your test where it's a short response. Now, for these type of tests, these type of questions, what I'm going to tell you is that generally I will try to find the correct answer in your responses. So if you write more on these questions, if you write me, If you write me a 3-paragraph response, first thing, I don't know what I did to make you mad at me, but if you write a 3-paragraph response here, I can try to pick out the correct answers, or you're more likely to get it right. Okay, so just a good test taking strategy there is that when you have a response or short response question like this, you take the opportunity to write a lot. Right? So the question says describe how both matter and energy cycle through a food web, starting with sunlight and soil. Right? So it wants me to talk about at least one producer, one primary consumer, one secondary consumer, and decomposers. So let me get my little drawing tool out. The key thing to remember when it comes to energy, and for energy I'm just going to put the letter E. So for energy, only moves up through the trophic chain. So it only goes from producers to primary consumers, and then primary consumers, secondary consumers to tertiary consumers. So energy only moves up through the trophic chain. While matter, which matter is just the physical stuff that you are made out of, your skin, your bones, your hair, or in the case of plants, the bark or leaves that grow on it, that's matter. So matter cycles endlessly through the trophic chain. Right? A good way of thinking about this is that when an organism dies, it decomposes and breaks down. That's where those decomposers come in. Okay? So if I were to tell a narrative about this, and do I have time? I don't have enough time to write it right now, but I do have enough time to talk about it. So ladies and gentlemen, make sure we're listening to this part. So when it says describe this, talk about at least one producer, a lot of times I would choose an actual example. So I would start with grass. I can literally write the answer. I'm going to start with the producer, grass. Grass is eaten by the primary consumer, deer. So the deer is later eaten by the secondary consumer, a wolf. Later on in its life, the wolf would die of old age and be broken down by decomposers. Decomposers can be earthworms or vultures or ravens, just animals or other organisms that eat dead things. Right. I will give you guys a little tip here for test taking strategies. If you want to help you picture this in your head, on the test, there will be a question with a picture of a food web on it. So if you want to narratively walk me through how this works, saying the corn is eaten by the grasshopper, grasshopper is then eaten by the frog, and then the frog is later eaten by the eagle, and the eagle later dies of old age and is decomposed by earthworms, ravens, or vultures back into the soil. Right? If you want to do that. Okay. Are there any other questions, comments, concerns on any of these questions? I'm actually going to